Dear friends, welcome to another episode today in the military world. In this video we'll talk about what many call a new era of empires or return to the politics of power where great power are. Redesigning borders and changing the global dynamics, and if it's still not inscribed into the channel already and triggered the novel bells to notify the novel bells so that the world began in 1945. When the World War II was born, in this time that victorious powers were gathered in San Francisco to establish the future historical marks that it was yet to ensure the future historical marks. That it was clear to avoid future historical marks of their historical marks size or power were treated with equality and respected the territorial integrity of each other as well, highlighted Harry Truman, so President of the United States. The responsibility of the great states is to serve and not dominate. This idealistic attempt to break with historical domination and conquest that has shaped the world for millennia, but today in the 20th century, how far we are of these ideals, at which point the UN has become an institution that no longer reflected the reality of the global power imperialism. The idea of the world as an example of the dynamics of power began by the global power dynamics of the world, began by the historical power and conquest that has become an example of the world since 2022. Rancha, emblematic of a power-searching reconquering imperial territories. Your invasion of the Ukraine invasion not only violated international treaties but also sought to reaffirm its role as a dominant force in the region by directly attacking the use of paramilitary forces as the Wagner Group, disinformation on global scale, and the use of energy as political weapon generated by the Ukraine invasion extends to the entire continent of OTAN, as well as the military unification as the unification group. The South China Sea has become a stage of growing tensions where Beijing directly defies the sovereignty of countries like Vietnam and Philippines with the construction of gigantic artificial islands, clearly demonstrating its intention to dominate this entire region. Beyond that, its support to Russia and the expansion of its Belt and Road Initiative are tools of a new economic imperialism, and now under Donald Trump resurfaced in the United States an imperialist regions as a sort of rhetorical control of the United American zones, as a sort of American control in one context of strong competition with a China that over the last few years has expanded by regions that since the 21st century have been facing the DCO as an attempt to regulate the nation's strategic backyard. These actions indicate a retrocess in the evolution of international relations, or are simply the dynamics that have always conducted. The concept of an international order based on rules has emerged as an attempt to regulate the behavior of nations, but how historically effective the nations repair and official zones of influence, as in Europe as in no rest of the world. However, the cost of that it was the suppression of smaller nations and the colonial exploration, like the sad and terrible cases we saw mainly on the African continent, where entire regions were dominated and exploited by the modern powers. In the modern context, the great blocks of power are replicating these dynamics in regions like Asia and Africa for many developing countries, offering the hope of escape from one multipolarity by one substitutions as their nations' practical actions on day-to-day indicate creation of influence zones that reduce even more the sovereignty of small countries. The failure of global institutions like the UN in facing recent crisis reinforces the perception that rules apply only to the weakness of this. In the case of the criminal court that indicted Vladimir Putin for war crimes which have prevented him from continuing honors in the Ukraine, from applying it, from doing solement of the law, from doing solement of the law, from doing what we are seeing in the Ukraine, from doing in order of the law since 2022. We're witnessing a transition from a world regulated by laws to a regulated world, where the future seems increasingly in content for smaller nations the UN create just to avoid this, facing deep challenges including the lack of fair representation in the Council of Security. Countries like Brazil, India and Japan with robust economies and even global influence have not permanent accounts of difficulties that are ancient by reforming the decade of the post-edition of post-Stieg, present of post-Stieg, points of postagent, post-wearies of power as the post-yuds of the post-war, present of the post-war, two of this as the post-22 world wearies, like the present Fmeek war of the postages of the present world war, Igers as the present Dane of the present Dionysus of the unindent powermals of this world, aseemable of the Anand. UN's inability to stop Russia of invading and attempting to attach Ukraine's new alternative regional blocs and pragmatic alternatives still have a role to fulfill. Many analysts the alternative failure is even worse, the end of the Ukraine and alternative regional blocs based on punctual interests, or be the world regional blocs based on punctual interests, or be the world regional blocs of volatile power and centered only in the detriment of a more ample and global view of this being, with the writing view of this being also in the occurrence of which can be also allowed in the occurrence of which can be found in the Ukraine between the nations of new regional blocs, and available example of the Ukraine and the good example of the nations and the good example of the Ukraine and the better part of the nations and the united stated instance of new blocs and women of alternative regional blocs and alternative regionalis and alternative blocs and alternative blocs and women of alternative bloc and alternate areas and alternative blocs and alternate areas to encladcade North Korea will be that we are dominated to a world where the strongest always win, or it's possible to find a new balance that promote international cooperation. The transition of a global order based on rules is clearly in progress, and as global society we need to question ours in this scenario and how we can influence these changes, and if it's not yet inscribed in the canal.